Most people imagine grief as something silent, a slow, private ache you nurse in solitude. And for the most part, it is, until someone like Karen Martinez decides your pain is her weekend project. The day everything shifted, the day grief turned from quiet to chaos, didn't start with police sirens or shouting. It began with a knock. That sharp, entitled knock that demanded attention as if the world itself owed her a response. That was Karen, HOA president, self-appointed saint, professional meddler. And there she was again, standing on my porch like she paid rent there. She wore that same brittle smile, the kind stretched tight enough to hide judgment underneath, and carried a clipboard in one hand, a stack of empty donation boxes in the other. Her timing, as usual, was cruelly perfect. I hadn't even finished my first sip of coffee when she began her sales pitch, all syrup and sanctimony. She spoke about the church's charity drive for underprivileged kids and how I could honor Michael's memory by donating his belongings. Her tone was soft, but her eyes were hard, the kind of gaze that doesn't comfort, it corners. I told her calmly, just as I had before, that I wasn't ready. My son Michael had been gone only 3 months, 17 years old, a car crash that stole his whole future in an instant. His room was still frozen in time. His backpack by the door, his baseball glove on the shelf, books stacked neatly on his desk like he'd come back any minute. I wasn't hoarding. I was holding on. But Karen didn't believe in emotional timelines unless they came printed on the HOA newsletter. She tilted her head, her tone dripping with pity and poison, and said something about how keeping a shrine was unhealthy, how property values could suffer from emotional stagnation. She talked about my grief like it was a code violation, as if sadness was something you could measure with a tape and fine by the square foot. Before leaving, she smiled that tight smile again and said, "I'll give you some time to reconsider. But don't let yourself wallow forever. That wasn't empathy. That was a warning." The next morning, I stepped outside to find a donation box sitting on my porch. No, just the box. The following day, another one appeared, this time with a flyer tucked inside about spiritual healing through giving. Then came the messages. Handwritten notes slipped under my door, left in my mailbox. They started as polite reminders about the donation deadline, then quotes from scripture. But soon the tone changed. The words grew sharper, condescending, little, jabs about letting go and selfishness, and how blessings can't reach those who cling to the past. I started, noticing the neighbors' glances too. The ones who used to wave now crossed the street instead. Conversation stopped when I walked by. Something was spreading. And it wasn't sympathy. A few days later, Janet Thompson from down the street caught me at the mailbox. She looked nervous, the kind of nervous that comes from being caught in the middle. She said Karen had been talking about me at HOA meetings, asking concerned questions about my mental health, wondering if my property was becoming a safety concern. Then Janet told me something that made my stomach drop. Karen had shown photos, pictures she'd taken of my driveway, of my son's room through the window. Janet tried to suggest a compromise, maybe donating a few small things to show goodwill. But I told her firmly, my grief wasn't a community project. That's when Karen turned up the pressure. More boxes, more letters. And this time, the notes used official language. Neglect, code violation, fire hazard. Karen wasn't trying to help anymore. She was building a case. Then came Friday, the morning that pushed everything over the edge. I opened my door and found Karen standing there again, this time with 5 volunteers from St. Matthew's Church. Matching t-shirts, matching smiles, matching unease. One woman looked genuinely concerned. Another couldn't meet my eyes. And at the front, like a general addressing her troops, stood Karen, clipboard in hand, voice dripping with performative concern. "We're here to help you," she said. That word, help, hit like a slap. They began taking turns, one by one, sharing perfectly rehearsed testimonies about how donating helped them heal. Karen stood behind them, nodding approvingly, her eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I told them calmly that they weren't coming inside, that Michael's things would stay where they were, and that my pain was not up for public discussion. That's when Karen snapped. Her face tightened. Her voice went high and shrill, and before anyone could move, she pulled out her phone. She raised it like a weapon and dialed 911, right there on my porch. I stood frozen as she told the dispatcher that there was a dangerous hoarding situation, describing imaginary piles of garbage, blocked hallways, and even rodent infestations. Then, with a theatrical sigh, she added that she feared for my mental stability. The church volunteers looked horrified. One stepped away. Another whispered to the person beside her. They hadn't signed up for this. They'd been told they were visiting a grieving father, not starring in a staged intervention for a crime that didn't exist. But Karen? Karen didn't blink. She stood tall, righteous, and cold as the sound of approaching sirens began to echo in the distance. She raised her voice, layering on more false concern. He won't let anyone in. I'm worried about his safety. There are piles everywhere. It's a fire hazard. I don't think he's bathing or cleaning properly. I stood there, silent, letting her lies fill the air. The damage was already done. The call had been made. And within 10 minutes, the stillness of our quiet neighborhood was shattered under the wail of approaching sirens. 2 patrol cars came screeching to a stop, red and blue lights flickering across the neatly trimmed lawns. Karen smiled, actually smiled, as the officers stepped out. To her, this was victory, her moment of righteous triumph. 2 officers approached, Sergeant Thompson, tall, calm, and authoritative, and Officer Rivera, younger, alert, and sharp-eyed. Karen practically sprinted toward them, waving her arms like someone reporting a major crime. She poured out her story with dramatic detail, hoarding, danger, mental instability, painting me as some unhinged recluse living in filth. She gestured toward my house as if they'd need to kick the door down to save me from myself. Sergeant Thompson listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he simply nodded and turned to me. "Sir, would you mind if we took a quick look inside?" "Not at all," I said, stepping aside. I had nothing to hide. The 2 officers entered my home, their radios humming softly. They walked through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, each room clean, organized, and quiet. When they reached Michael's room, they paused. It wasn't messy. It wasn't unsafe. It was simply untouched, exactly as my son had left it. His baseball glove sat on the shelf, his desk neat, his posters still on the wall. The air carried the faint scent of his cologne. It wasn't decay. It was a memory. When the officers came back outside, Karen's expression had changed. Her confidence faltered. Her smile had cracked. Sergeant Thompson began asking her questions about the hazards, the rodents, the mental health concerns. Her voice wavered. She stumbled over her words, trying to soften her accusations, claiming she had only been worried. But Officer Rivera had already been taking notes. Each exaggerated statement, every false claim, it was all documented now, word for word. Then, the sergeant pulled Karen aside. I couldn't hear everything, but his tone was sharp and professional, the kind of tone that carries weight. I watched Karen's posture change, her shoulders sinking as realization hit her like a slow, cold wave. Meanwhile, Rivera returned to me. I told him everything, the boxes, the flyers, the handwritten notes, the gossip she'd spread at HOA meetings. I even handed him the latest flyer she'd left on my porch that morning. He looked it over, then asked, "Would you like to file a harassment report?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. When Sergeant Thompson stepped back toward us, he didn't mince words. "Mrs. Martinez," he said firmly, "filing a false police report is a criminal offense. You've wasted emergency resources and made serious accusations without evidence." Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. She stammered, muttering something about doing what was best for the community, but the spell was broken. Her so-called volunteers, her audience, looked away. One crossed her arms. Another stepped back, hiding partially behind a tree. They wanted no part of what came next. Officer Rivera read her rights as he placed her under arrest. The metallic click of the handcuffs seemed to echo across the cul-de-sac. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Curtains fluttered as neighbors peeked out. A few even recorded on their phones, the irony not lost on anyone. Karen's face was no longer smug. It was flushed, confused, and hollow. She looked smaller somehow, deflated by the weight of her own arrogance. By sunset, the story was everywhere. The neighborhood group chat lit up. Word spread through town faster than wildfire. St. Matthew's Church issued a public statement, condemning her actions and clarifying that she had acted alone. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that same evening and suspended her indefinitely, citing abuse of power and the risk of legal exposure. The charges came soon after: filing a false report, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. In court, her lawyer pleaded for leniency, insisting she'd acted out of concern. But the evidence spoke louder than any excuse. There were photos of her notes, screenshots of her messages, and recordings of her self-righteous speeches at HOA meetings. Even her own neighbors testified about the pressure, the gossip, the manipulation. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, his words cut through the courtroom like thunder. 30 days in jail, a 500 fine, 100 hours of community service. The gavel struck, final, unshakable. I sat there, watching the woman who had tormented me for months finally face the consequences of her cruelty. As the bailiff led her away, Karen's face mirrored the exact expression she'd worn the day the police first arrived. Not righteous, not powerful, just lost. Afterward, several of the volunteers approached me in the hallway. They apologized genuinely. Most of them hadn't known how far Karen had gone. They'd been misled, caught in her storm of control disguised as charity. I didn't blame them. Grief makes people uncomfortable. It drives them to find meaning in other people's pain. And when someone like Karen gives them a purpose wrapped in sanctimony, it's easy to get swept up. But I had never needed saving. I needed space. And now finally I had it. Not peace, not yet, but justice. And for the first time since Michael's funeral, I could finally breathe again. If you believe no one should ever be harassed for how they grieve, like this video and subscribe for more stories that expose the truth and stand up to injustice.